The Galactic Council closed the file. The star was dying. Calculations were flawless. 9 billion lives marked as acceptable loss. The inhabitants of the planet accepted the end, prepared to die with dignity, without panic, without hope. Then human ships tore into the system. Without permission, without ceremony, without certainty of success. No one had asked for help. No one promised they could save everyone. But the humans asked only one question: who do we save first? And that question shattered the galaxy's logic. If you want to see what happens when humanity decides that someone else's extinction is their problem, stay tuned. Because what comes next is salvation, and the universe will pay the price. Cold light washed across the chamber as star maps rotated in silence, their pale glow reflecting from crystalline walls that had never known heat or decay. The dying star pulsed on the central projection, its surface crawling with violent flares, each eruption measured, categorized, and reduced to data. The air carried the faint sterile scent of ionized filtration fields, untouched by smoke, sweat, or fear. Somewhere deep within the station's structure, gravitic stabilizers hummed with patient regularity, indifferent to the end of a world. The Council of Stellar Continuity had already closed the file. To them, the system was no longer a place but a calculation, a sequence of probabilities that resolved into inevitability. The star had entered terminal instability, its core oscillations charted with flawless precision, its collapse predicted down to the final gravitational ripple. In less than 2 standard cycles, radiation would scour the inner orbits, tearing atmospheres away molecule by molecule, boiling oceans into expanding ghosts of vapor. The third planet, once vibrant with motion and sound, had been assigned a final designation. Nearly 9 billion sentient lives reduced to acceptable loss, not through cruelty or neglect, but through arithmetic so clean it felt almost virtuous. Across that distant world, the sky had begun to change color. The star burned brighter each day, its light harsher, tinged with unfamiliar hues that set teeth on edge and made exposed skin prickle with static heat. The inhabitants felt it in their bones long before the instruments confirmed it. Their civilization had been shaped by probabilistic philosophy, by the belief that meaning emerged from understanding limits rather than defying them. Acceptance was not surrender, but wisdom refined over millennia. Temples filled with the low resonance of closing rituals, their air heavy with incense designed to slow heartbeats and quiet trembling limbs. No prayers for rescue rose toward the heavens. Instead, minds turned inward, contemplating completion. Cities dimmed their lights, towers fading into soft silhouettes against the star's swollen glare. Power grids were rerouted away from comfort and toward preservation, feeding vast archives where histories, art, and memory were compressed into cold, enduring substrates. Fingers lingered on familiar surfaces. Tools were cleaned one last time. Small habits, practiced even at the edge of annihilation, persisted as acts of quiet defiance against panic. Children learned songs meant not to inspire hope, but to teach grace in endings. Their voices carried through streets that smelled of cooling stone and recycled air, fragile notes swallowed by the vastness above. Parents listened with steady faces and aching chests, imprinting every sound, every movement, into memory that would soon have nowhere to go. From orbit, Council observers watched with muted respect. There was no chaos, no irrational evacuation attempts, no wasteful expenditure of resources against certainty. Dignity radiated from the planet like a final signal, calm and contained. In the logic of the galaxy, it was a beautiful extinction. Starlight screamed across sensor arrays as the swollen sun shed another skin of plasma, a tearing brightness that flooded every wavelength and made even hardened observation decks flare with warning halos. Cooling systems exhaled thin metallic vapor, sharp and dry, as if the stations themselves tasted the coming death. Across dozens of empires, analysts leaned into their instruments, watching the same curves rise on their displays, feeling the same detached satisfaction as predictions held true. The galaxy agreed with the Council of Stellar Continuity. The equation was sound. Distance strangled possibility, time gnawed away at courage, and resources were chains that bound even the most ambitious powers. Evacuation was dismissed with barely a ripple of debate. The system lay too far from major corridors, the transport windows too narrow, the energy cost grotesquely out of proportion to any conceivable return. Billions of lives, when converted into fuel expenditure, fleet wear, and logistical collapse, simply did not balance the ledger. Rescue fleets existed for conquest, for deterrence, for profit carved from nebulae and shattered enemies. They were blunt instruments forged in paranoia and ambition, not vessels of mercy. To divert them for a doomed population that offered no strategic leverage, no rare materials, no political influence, was unthinkable. Rational polities survived by learning where to draw lines, and this was one of them. Sympathy, when allowed to override calculation, had ended more civilizations than war ever had. On the surface of the third planet, the light no longer faded into night. The star's expansion had transformed the sky into a permanent false dawn, a glaring ceiling of angry gold and bleeding white that never cooled. Shadows sharpened until they cut like blades. Buildings groaned as materials expanded under relentless heat, their surfaces warm to the touch even in what had once been the coldest hours. The air smelled of ozone and scorched dust, a faint tang that lingered at the back of every breath. Sensors buried deep beneath the crust recorded what faces refused to show. Panic hormones rose in slow, inexorable waves, threading through bloodstreams that had been trained for generations to remain calm. Hearts beat faster. Sleep fractured into shallow fragments. Muscles trembled with unused energy, the body's ancient protest against surrender. Ritual calm held on the surface, maintained through discipline and culture, but it frayed at the edges. Even acceptance, when pressed by extinction, began to crack. In cities built for quiet contemplation, people walked familiar routes with deliberate care, memorizing the texture of stone beneath their feet, the way light refracted through carved arches, the subtle differences in recycled air from one district to another. Markets continued to open, not to trade for the future, but to preserve the cadence of ordinary days. Hands brushed across fabrics, tools, data slates, committing sensation to memory, as if the act itself could anchor existence a moment longer. The wider galaxy watched these details through filtered feeds and summarized reports. Cultural analysts noted the elegance of resignation. Sociologists praised the efficiency with which a civilization could prepare for its own erasure. There was admiration, distant and sterile, for a species that met annihilation without screaming. The system was labeled a tragedy, yes, but it contained one. No cascading wars. No destabilized borders. No precedent that would haunt future decisions. Data packets flowed through interstellar networks, tagged, archived, and scheduled for eventual memorialization. Educational repositories flagged the event as a case study in graceful decline. Art collectives commissioned abstract representations of a sun consuming its children. The system's name began to appear in past tense even before the star finished swelling. It was already becoming history. And yet the universe, vast and indifferent, allowed no comfort. Radiation levels climbed faster than expected. Magnetic storms gnawed at orbital infrastructure, forcing emergency power reroutes. Several monitoring platforms were abandoned when their shielding proved insufficient. Even the observers felt a faint unease as margins narrowed. The math still held, but it creaked, like a bridge under too much certainty. On the planet below, the strain leaked through despite centuries of conditioning. In secluded spaces, away from temples and public squares, bodies shook. Tears fell silently, evaporating almost as soon as they touched heated stone. Old scars ached without reason. Some inhabitants found themselves standing still for long stretches, staring at nothing, overwhelmed by a sensation they had no language for. It was not fear alone, nor sorrow, but a deep biological refusal to accept that existence could be summed up and discarded. The Council registered these developments with professional detachment. Increased stress indicators were expected. End-stage phenomena always produced noise at the edges of composure. The important variables remained unchanged. The star's mass continued to rise. Its core oscillations tightened. The countdown shortened with merciless regularity. Less than 2 standard cycles remained, and every projection agreed on what followed. The final consensus propagated outward, passing through bureaucracies, militaries, and academic circles. This was a loss, but not a failure. The galaxy had done what it could by acknowledging it. Morning would come later, once the danger had passed and the silence settled. After that, attention would shift elsewhere, to crises that still offered solutions. Then the long-range detectors flinched. At the fringes of the system, instruments designed to ignore background chaos registered something that did not belong. Not radiation, not debris, not the predictable turbulence of a star tearing itself apart. It was structured, directional, and growing louder by the second. Drives burned in patterns that defied optimal approach vectors, dumping heat and energy into space with reckless enthusiasm. Gravitational wakes overlapped where no fleet doctrine would ever allow them. Alerts cascaded through observation decks, their tones sharp and dissonant against the usual calm. Analysts reran their models, searching for errors. No authorized traffic was scheduled. No empire had declared an intervention. The anomaly refused to resolve into any known configuration, its signature swelling far faster than inertia alone could explain. Against the vast, ordered indifference of the cosmos, something was coming that had not asked permission, had not requested feasibility assessments, and had not accepted the conclusion that this system was already dead. The first human drives tore into real space like open wounds, flooding the outer system with raw noise and radiation, a thunderous distortion that rattled sensor arrays and made automated alarms shriek across observation stations. Space itself seemed to recoil as fusion exhaust flared blue, white, and violet, leaving rippling scars of heat where silence had ruled moments before. There was no grace to the arrival, no careful insertion along approved vectors. The airless void filled with the taste of burned metal and ionized particles, sharp even through layers of shielding. Human vessels spilled out of the jump like a storm losing cohesion. Transports drifted alongside cargo haulers whose hulls still bore the scars of industrial labor. Retrofitted colony ships limped in with mismatched plating and engines pushed far beyond recommended tolerances. Hospital barges followed, their white surfaces already scorched, running hot enough that cooling vents bled vapor into space. Ships designed for mining, for research, for luxury travel had been stripped, hollowed, and repurposed into blunt instruments of capacity and speed. No single flagship anchored the formation. No ceremonial envoy announced intent. The fleet was a swarm, uneven and jagged, its geometry dictated not by doctrine but by desperation. Observers across the system struggled to impose meaning on what they saw. Identification protocols flickered as databases attempted to classify the vessels, failing again and again as modifications defied standard profiles. This was not how rational powers moved fleets. The approach ignored stealth entirely, broadcasting intent with every screaming drive plume. The radiation signature alone guaranteed detection across dozens of light years. To arrive like this, so loud and exposed, bordered on insanity. Calculations updated in real time, and the verdict remained unchanged. The evacuation window had already closed. The star's instability accelerated daily. Radiation storms gnawed at orbital space. Even if every human ship were filled beyond structural safety margins, even if life support were pushed to the edge of collapse, the numbers did not reconcile. Billions could not be moved in the time remaining. Not by anyone. Not ever. Yet the humans did not slow. Orbital anchors fired into the void, their mass drivers kicking against fragile hulls as they established temporary gravity wells where none should exist. Atmospheric entry corridors ignited, carving incandescent scars through the planet's upper layers as shields flared and screamed under thermal stress. Navigation beacons blossomed across the system like artificial stars, their signals overlapping in deliberate chaos, flooding every frequency with instructions, warnings, and alignment data. Mass coordination protocols lit up planetary networks that had been preparing for silence, not salvation. The speed of it was overwhelming. Within moments of arrival, Human systems had threaded themselves into infrastructure never meant to interface with foreign technology. Power grids spiked. Traffic control arrays overloaded. Ancient planetary systems designed to manage orderly decline buckled under the sudden demand for movement. Elevators meant for ceremonial use were flooded with evacuation routing data. Transit hubs lit up with emergency lighting as if awakening from a long sleep. From orbit, the planet looked like it was convulsing. Lines of motion traced across continents as ground vehicles surged toward unexpected destinations. Launch platforms extended that had not moved in generations, their mechanisms screaming in protest as they unlocked. The constant false dawn from the dying star reflected off hulls descending through atmosphere, turning the sky into a lattice of fire and shadow. The population did not greet this with gratitude. Centuries of philosophical conditioning shattered in the span of hours. The carefully cultivated calm that had carried them toward extinction collapsed under the weight of possibility. Minds trained to accept inevitability recoiled from it when presented with an alternative. Systems designed for ritual closure were overwhelmed by bodies in motion, by conflicting signals, by the raw animal surge of survival instincts long buried beneath layers of culture. Panic erupted, not as mindless chaos, but as something sharper and more painful. Hope, once dismissed as childish abstraction, slammed into reality with enough force to fracture societies. People ran without knowing where to go, clutched possessions that no longer mattered, froze mid-step as the scale of what was happening crushed them. Streets filled with sound, not of mourning songs, but of feet striking heated stone, of transport engines whining under overload, of structures groaning as crowds pressed against them. The air thickened with the smell of sweat and ozone. Skin burned under the relentless light as bodies packed together, heat radiating from living masses that had never planned to gather again. Breath came fast and shallow, lungs struggling to reconcile terror and exhilaration. Some collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of meaning. Others moved with ferocious clarity, dragging the stunned and the elderly towards signals they barely understood. From above, human vessels plunged again and again, their hulls shuddering as they fought gravity and radiation simultaneously. Pilots ignored warning thresholds as shields flared red and then white, bleeding energy in sheets of light. Docking procedures abandoned elegance entirely, replaced by brute force alignment and magnetic clamps that slammed together hard enough to rattle bones inside. Ramps dropped onto scorched ground, and internal lights spilled out, harsh and bright, cutting through the oppressive glow of the star. Human crews moved with frantic purpose. Bodies strained inside pressure suits, soaked with sweat. Hands shook as they operated controls pushed past safe limits. Muscles screamed as cargo holds were cleared, benches torn out, every possible space converted into room for living bodies. Medics prepped triage stations without knowing who would arrive first. Engineers rerouted power with bleeding fingers, overriding safeties they had been trained never to touch. To external observers, the operation radiated a kind of defiance that bordered on sacrilege. The humans were not negotiating with time. They were assaulting it. Every action carried the unspoken rejection of finality, as if the concept itself were an enemy that could be outworked, outpaced, and finally broken through sheer refusal to accept it. The planet responded in kind. Where there had been resignation, there was now raw struggle. Where there had been quiet dignity, there was screaming motion. Social order dissolved not into savagery, but into something more primal and honest. The need to live tore through centuries of philosophical restraint, exposing the fragile core beneath. People helped and hindered one another in equal measure, driven by instincts that did not care about cultural ideals. Sensors buried deep beneath the surface recorded unprecedented spikes. Hormone levels surged beyond anything previously documented. Heart rate soared. Neural activity flared in chaotic patterns as minds attempted to process a future that had been declared impossible and then forcibly reopened. Above it all, the dying star continued to swell, indifferent to hope or heroism. Its light beat down mercilessly, bleaching colors, cracking materials, reminding everyone that the clock had not stopped. Yet for the first time since the calculations had been finalized, the system was no longer quiet. It roared with motion, with fear, with effort, and with a sound the galaxy had not expected to hear here. The sound of a civilization fighting not with weapons or arguments, but with bodies, engines, and sheer will against an ending that had already been written. Chapter 4 engines screamed as hulls struck ground that had never been meant to receive them, the impact sending vibrations through plazas of polished stone and fields of cultivated soil alike. Dust and ash rose in choking clouds, carrying the bitter smell of scorched minerals and ruptured irrigation lines. Landing struts punched into ancient walkways, cracking monuments that had been built to endure centuries, not seconds. The sky above flickered with heat distortion as descending vessels burned through atmosphere at angles no regulation manual would ever approve. Human logistics unraveled every established model. There were no immaculate queues, no stratified priorities based on projected productivity or genetic legacy. Evacuation flowed according to proximity, vulnerability, and simple presence. Whoever was closest to a ramp moved first. Whoever could not run was carried. Families were kept together by instinct rather than policy, hands locked tight enough to bruise as ramps swallowed them into the glare of interior lights. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, sharing recycled air and racing heartbeats, bound by circumstance rather than culture. Cargo holds designed for machinery filled with living bodies until heat and condensation coated every surface. Life support systems groaned under loads they were never certified to bear, alarms silenced or overridden without ceremony. Safety margins dissolved. Redundancy was stripped away piece by piece. Perfection, that cherished ideal of stable civilizations, was discarded without regret. Speed became the only virtue that mattered. Above the planet, the star's instability accelerated beyond even pessimistic forecasts. Its surface tore itself open in incandescent flares that ripped through space like warning screams, hammering shields and bleeding radiation into every orbit. Several human vessels vanished in sudden, blinding bursts as hulls failed and containment fields collapsed. Their loss registered as flickers on distant sensors and as silent absences where signals should have been. The fleet did not slow. Gaps closed almost immediately as replacement vessels surged forward, captains bending trajectories mid-burn, engines howling as they dove deeper into danger to retrieve those left behind. Formation discipline shattered further, ships weaving through debris and radiation with brutal improvisation. Every maneuver carried the taste of ozone and the tremor of near catastrophe. Inside the vessels, medical crews worked without pause. Hands trembled as stimulants were administered, burns treated, fractures stabilized in spaces that reeked of sweat, antiseptic, and fear. Exhaustion clung to bodies like a second skin, muscles cramping, vision blurring at the edges. Minds frayed under the relentless pressure of decisions that could not be revisited. And still the humans moved, driven by something that refused rest. Their own limits became visible, faces drawn tight beneath helmets. Blood seeping through gloves where skin had split. Breathing ragged, hearts hammering against ribs pushed far beyond regulatory thresholds. Training manuals lost relevance. Survival replaced procedure. To the watching galaxy, the spectacle was unsettling. Resources were being incinerated for no strategic outcome. Vessels worth fortunes were being risked and destroyed for strangers who had never petitioned for aid, who offered no treaties, no allegiance, no future advantage. By every rational measure, the operation was obscene, yet the evacuation accelerated. Against the infinite cold of space and the dying fury of a star, fragile lives were lifted screaming into the void, not because it was efficient, but because someone had decided that leaving them behind was unacceptable. Metal screamed as a transport slammed down onto stone that had never known thrust or flame, its landing struts punching through a ceremonial plaza and sending fractures racing like lightning across carved symbols older than most civilizations. Dust billowed upward in choking clouds, carrying the bitter scent of pulverized mineral and scorched atmosphere. Grass in nearby fields ignited under exhaust wash, curling into blackened spirals as engines howled at full burn, fighting gravity, radiation, and time all at once. Human logistics unraveled every established model in the galaxy. Spaceports were ignored, their orderly queues and calibrated descent vectors deemed luxuries no one could afford. Vessels landed wherever there was space enough to survive the impact, crushing monuments, flattening gardens, shattering the geometry of cities that had been designed for stillness and ritual rather than urgency. Hulls scraped towers. Stabilizers gouged trenches through soil and pavement alike. The planet was being scarred, but it was alive, and that was suddenly all that mattered. Evacuation priorities defied every algorithm observers attempted to apply. No assessments of economic productivity guided the flow. No genetic curation shaped who moved first. The humans worked by proximity, by vulnerability, by the brutal simplicity of who was there and who could be reached fastest. Those closest to the ramps were taken. Those who could no longer walk were lifted. Children, elders, the injured, the stunned, were pulled aboard with equal urgency. Families were kept together not because it was efficient, but because separating them slowed hands and broke minds. Strangers were pressed side by side, sharing breath and heat, packed into spaces never intended to hold so many living bodies at once. Cargo holds filled until structural limits groaned in protest. Life support systems screamed warnings that were acknowledged and then overridden. Safety margins dissolved into memory. Redundancy was abandoned, backup plans sacrificed to momentum. Perfection, so prized by other civilizations, was traded willingly for speed. The humans did not optimize for survival probabilities. They optimized for saving one more life before the next flare hit. Above the planet, the star's instability accelerated beyond projections. Its surface convulsed, tearing loose titanic arcs of plasma that slashed through space like warning screams. Radiation storms rolled outward in violent waves, rattling shields and cooking exposed electronics. Several human ships vanished in blinding flashes as their hulls failed, metal and lives erased into expanding halos of light. Debris scattered across orbit, glowing briefly before dissolving into the star's glare. The fleet did not slow. Replacement vessels surged forward to fill the gaps, engines flaring as captains altered trajectories mid-burn, skimming the edge of lethal zones to scoop up those left behind. Navigation paths shifted by the second, recalculated not for elegance, but for audacity. Some ships limped away trailing atmosphere and fire. Others pushed deeper despite failing systems, driven by the knowledge that turning back empty was a sin no one aboard could bear. Inside the ships, the air was thick with sweat, antiseptic, and recycled breath. Medical crews worked without rest, hands trembling as they administered stimulants, stabilizers, and hydration to bodies on the edge of collapse. Exhaustion weighed like lead on muscles and minds, but there was no pause long enough to feel it. Passengers shook with shock, eyes wide and unfocused, lungs struggling to draw air that felt too thin, too hot, too real. Terror rippled through the packed holds, punctuated by moments of stunned silence when the reality of continued existence overwhelmed everything else. The humans were not immune. Their bodies bore the cost of sustained overload. Heart rate spiked and refused to come down. Muscles cramped and tore under repeated strain. Vision blurred as sleep deprivation gnawed at the edges of consciousness. Minds frayed under relentless pressure, haunted by images of those they could not reach, by alarms they chose to silence, by calculations they refused to make. Yet they continued, driven by something that did not register on any sensor array. Small habits surfaced even here, even now. Hands checked straps again and again, fingers tracing familiar motions to anchor shaking nerves. Some pressed foreheads briefly to cold bulkheads, grounding themselves in the solidity of metal. Others carried tokens in sealed pockets, fragments of home that reminded them why they were here. There was fear, vast and constant, but it did not rule them. It was carried, endured, used. From the perspective of the watching galaxy, the operation bordered on obscenity. Resources burned at a rate that would cripple lesser powers for generations. Fuel reserves emptied into empty space. Hulls were sacrificed for passengers whose names would never be known. Lives were risked and lost for strangers who had never asked for salvation, who had already accepted their own extinction. No strategic outcome justified this expenditure. No territorial gain waited at the end. There was only loss measured against loss, and the humans chose the Messier equation. Observation stations recorded the chaos with mounting unease. Models collapsed as assumptions failed. Every time analysts predicted a slowdown, the evacuation accelerated instead. When projected casualty thresholds were exceeded, the humans did not withdraw. They pushed harder, flying closer to the star, landing in narrower windows, stripping ships of non-essential mass to make room for more bodies. What looked like desperation from the outside resolved into grim discipline when viewed up close. On the planet's surface, the rhythm of movement intensified. Ramps rose and fell in endless cycles. Ground shook under constant thrust. The false dawn from the star mixed with the harsh white of landing lights, casting everything in stark contrast. Skin burned and cracked under radiation filters stretched thin. Voices were hoarse from shouting directions that changed faster than they could be learned. Still, people moved, helping and hindering in equal measure, driven by the undeniable pull of escape. There were moments when it nearly broke, when a flare struck too close and shields flickered, when a ship lifted off seconds too late, its silhouette consumed by light, when medics collapsed against bulkheads, empty syringes falling from numb fingers. Each time, others stepped in, dragging bodies aside, taking over tasks without ceremony or recognition. The evacuation did not belong to individuals anymore. It had become a single, grinding motion, a collective act of defiance sustained by thousands of exhausted hands. The dying star loomed larger with every passing hour, its gravity tugging at hulls and hearts alike. Space itself seemed to warp under its rage, bending light and distorting time. The clock was merciless. Every calculation screamed that this could not continue, and yet it did. Against reason, against doctrine, against the quiet approval of a galaxy that had already moved on, the human fleet kept coming and going, burning through impossibility with engines and bodies and will. The evacuation accelerated not because it made sense, but because stopping meant accepting and ending that someone, somewhere, might still escape. In the infinite darkness between stars, this was a small thing, a brief flare of activity, soon to be swallowed by cosmic silence. But within that fleeting moment, fragile lives were being torn from the jaws of certainty, carried screaming and shaking into an unknown future. And that, to the humans, was worth everything they were spending and everything they were becoming. The first shock arrived as a pressure that had no medium, a silent hammer blow that rattled hulls and bones alike before any sensor could translate it into warning. Space itself seemed to recoil as the star's core finally lost coherence, its mass folding inward and then rebounding in a paroxysm of light. Radiation screamed across the void in concentric waves, brighter than memory, hotter than language. The inner planets vanished inside that expanding fury, continents and oceans reduced to incandescent vapor in a span shorter than a single heartbeat. Cities that had dimmed their lights in preparation for a dignified end were erased so completely that even their shadows were burned away. The smell inside the fleeing human ships changed as alarms triggered and filters strained, a sharp metallic tang of overheated circuitry and ionized air. Decks vibrated under sustained maximum thrust, a constant shudder that blurred vision and rattled teeth. Engines screamed with a sound that was felt rather than heard, a deep, animal resonance that carried desperation in every oscillation. Navigation displays washed out under radiation interference, forcing crews to rely on dead reckoning and half-remembered calculations made under unbearable pressure. Behind them, the system died. Sensors confirmed what eyes could barely comprehend. Where orbital paths had once traced elegant arcs around a living star, there was now only expanding debris and lethal light. The third planet, with its scarred plazas and shattered temples, did not even merit a residual signature. It had been consumed down to its last atom, folded into the violence of stellar death, and scattered across the void. Silence followed, vast and absolute, broken only by the fading echoes of a catastrophe too large to mourn properly. The human fleet ran. Vectors were chosen not for efficiency, but for survival, plotted in frantic consensus as each ship fought to outrun annihilation. Some engines flared and died mid-burn, their vessels tumbling helplessly until rescue tugs latched on or, failing that, until the radiation wave overtook them. Hull plating glowed dull red, then white, shedding layers into space like burning leaves. Shields flickered, collapsed, reignited, each cycle shaving away margins that had already been sacrificed. Time stretched, distorted by fear and acceleration, seconds dragging into eternities measured in heartbeats and clenched fists. When the last radiation wave finally dissipated, thinning into harmless background noise, the fleet drifted into a staggered formation that barely resembled order. Exhaust plumes faded, engines throttled down, coughing and sputtering as systems screamed for rest they would not receive. Inside the ships, gravity returned unevenly, dropping bodies to decks slick with condensation and spilled fluids. Some passengers laughed uncontrollably, others wept in hoarse, broken gasps. Many simply stared, eyes unfocused, minds struggling to accept continued existence. The count began. Data flowed through battered networks, numbers accumulating slowly as damaged systems synced and resensed. Names were checked where names existed. Tallies rose, hesitated, rose again. More than 7 billion lives had been torn from extinction and carried into uncertain exile. Holds were overflowing with survivors who had expected to die beneath a dying star and now found themselves breathing recycled air among strangers. Children slept in exhausted heaps. Elders clutched fragments of a world that no longer existed. Entire cultures, compressed into cargo bays and corridors, waited in stunned silence for meaning to catch up with reality. Not all had made it. Never all. The losses weighed heavily, a presence felt even where it could not yet be quantified. Entire regions had been unreachable when the final flare struck. Ships had been vaporized mid-ascent, their passengers lost so completely that even debris fields could not mark where they had fallen. Human casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, crews who had pushed their vessels beyond tolerance until metal and flesh failed together. Medics moved through the aftermath with hollow eyes, recording deaths with shaking hands, administering comfort where healing was no longer possible. By any rational metric recognized by the wider galaxy, the operation was a failure. Resources expended exceeded the projected value of the saved population many times over. Fleet readiness was shattered. Industrial output would suffer for generations. The rescued offered no strategic advantage, no immediate return on investment. The loss ratio violated doctrines etched into the foundations of interstellar governance. Calculations, when run cold and clean, returned the same conclusion again and again. This had been a mistake. And yet, within the ships, something unquantifiable filled the air alongside exhaustion and grief. Survivors helped one another stand. Strangers shared water, blankets, fragments of food salvaged from emergency stores. Medical teams treated not only burns and radiation sickness, but the quieter wounds of shock and survivor-esque guilt. Humans slumped against bulkheads, faces drawn and hollow, and still reached out to steady trembling hands that were not their own. There was no triumph here, no celebration. Only the raw, stubborn fact of life continuing where it had been mathematically eliminated. The Council of Stellar Continuity observed from a careful distance, their instruments pristine, their chambers unshaken by the violence that had rewritten an entire system. They received the final data burst and processed it in silence. Models were rerun with updated parameters. Losses were subtracted. Gains were added. The outcome refused to stabilize. The equation no longer balanced. Something had been introduced that resisted isolation. A variable that could not be removed without invalidating the entire structure. The humans had acted against probability, against incentive, against the calm wisdom of acceptance. They had burned fuel, lives, and futures for beings who had not demanded rescue, who had already made peace with extinction. No line of logic could account for that choice without redefining the value of life itself. Observers noted subtle shifts in their own responses. Where there had once been muted respect for dignified extinction, there was now unease. Where calculations had closed files with finality, there was hesitation. The galaxy had witnessed an ending, but it had also witnessed defiance carried to its logical extreme, beyond success or failure as traditionally defined. In the vast dark beyond the ruined system, the human fleet regrouped as best it could, wounded and diminished, carrying the weight of billions of fragile futures. Engines cooled. Systems were patched with improvised fixes and sheer will. There was no clear destination yet, only the knowledge that stopping meant letting grief harden into paralysis. So they continued, slow and scarred, a moving testament to a choice that numbers alone could not justify. The dead star collapsed inward upon itself, leaving behind a gravity well and a lesson that would ripple outward for cycles to come. The universe had been indifferent, as it always was. But within that indifference, a species had screamed into the void with engines and flesh and stubborn compassion, and the void had not been able to erase the echo. The council recalculated again, and again the answer refused to settle. In the space where certainty had once reigned, something new took root. Not hope, not yet, but doubt. And for a galaxy built on cold arithmetic, that was the most unsettling result of all. Rain fell in uneven sheets across an unfamiliar sky, warm droplets striking bare soil with a sound that startled those who heard it for the first time. The smell of living earth rose into the air, rich and heavy, carrying hints of minerals and decay and promise all at once. Beneath temporary shelters and half-assembled structures, survivors flinched at the sensation, some reaching out with trembling hands as if the ground itself might vanish. Gravity here felt slightly wrong. The light bent at an angle their eyes had not learned to trust. And yet, the rain did not burn, the air did not scream with radiation, and the star above them held steady. They were scattered across dozens of worlds, redistributed by human fleets that refused to treat trauma as a logistical complication. Transports arrived battered and scarred, crews hollow-eyed and slow-moving, and still they stayed. They helped unload not only bodies, but histories. They carried archives by hand when cranes were unavailable. They sat beside the rescued through long nights, sharing silence thick with memories of a sky that no longer existed. There was no expectation of gratitude, no demand for cultural repayment. What had been taken from extinction was now a shared responsibility. Medical wards overflowed with quiet suffering. Some wounds were obvious, skin mottled by radiation exposure, lungs scarred from chemical burns, muscles weakened by starvation and stress. Others were invisible, buried behind eyes that stared too long at nothing, minds that replayed the final moments of a planet again and again. Humans moved among them with practiced care, learning alien biologies through trial and error, adapting protocols, making mistakes, correcting them. Exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, but they persisted, driven by a refusal to abandon those they had already carried so far. Memorials rose slowly, not only for the dead, but for the planet itself. Stone and metal and light were shaped into forms meant to endure unfamiliar weather. The Lost World's name was etched in multiple scripts, spoken with reverence by mouths that had never known its gravity or its songs. Humans stood beside survivors during dedication rituals, heads bowed, hands clasped, sharing grief that was not entirely their own. The absence left by annihilation was given shape, acknowledged rather than ignored, honored rather than archived. The rescued civilization struggled to understand what had been done to them. Their philosophy had prepared them for an ending, for the slow dimming of lights and the careful closing of memory. Instead, they had been torn violently into continuation. Survival felt like betrayal to some, like theft from a destiny they had already accepted. Purpose had to be rebuilt from fragments, identity reassembled without the anchor of a homeworld. The humans did not rush this process. They offered time, space, and the unsettling assurance that confusion was allowed. Children adapted fastest. They learned new skies by instinct, chasing unfamiliar insects beneath alien suns, laughter breaking through the weight that pressed so heavily on their elders. Humans watched them with a mixture of relief and sorrow, aware that resilience often came hand in hand with forgetting. Adults followed more slowly, finding meaning in reconstruction, in shared labor, in the quiet miracle of planting seeds and watching something grow where nothing had before. Across the galaxy, the aftershocks spread. Councils convened to review procedures that had stood unchallenged for thousands of cycles. Extinction scenarios, once sealed with finality, were reopened. Models were amended with reluctant annotations. The loss of a system was no longer considered an isolated tragedy, but a potential summons. Observers replayed sensor logs of the evacuation again and again, searching for the point where rationality had failed and something else had taken over. They found no clean answer. Humanity was not the strongest species, nor the most technologically refined. Their ships bore scars and improvisations that offended aesthetic sensibilities. Their logistics lacked elegance. Their decision-making appeared chaotic, emotional, inefficient. And yet, when faced with inevitable loss, they had acted with a consistency that unsettled empires and councils alike. They had not asked whether salvation was deserved. They had not weighed cultural compatibility or long-term benefit. They had asked only who could be saved first, and then behaved as if the universe were obligated to make room. This trait resisted classification. It was not simple altruism, nor blind heroism. It was a refusal to accept that inevitability equaled permission. A belief, buried deep in human history, that endings were challenges rather than conclusions. That even when the math said stop, someone had to try anyway. To the cold frameworks of galactic planning, this was deeply problematic. From that day forward, files closed with less confidence. Somewhere in the layered equations that governed response protocols, a note appeared in human script, awkward and out of place among pristine symbols. Evacuation might arrive even if no one asked. Probability alone was no longer sufficient to guarantee abandonment. The presence of humans in a sector introduced uncertainty not as a flaw, but as a feature. Among the resettled, stories spread quietly. Not tales of conquest or dominance, but of hands reaching out in the final hours. Of engines roaring against the dying light. Of beings who had come uninvited, unasked, and refused to leave until time itself forced them away. These stories did not inspire worship. They inspired vigilance. A sense that the universe, vast and indifferent, could still be argued with if one was loud enough, stubborn enough, and willing to bleed for strangers. The human fleets eventually departed, called away by other crises, other impossible calculations waiting to be broken. They left behind advisors, builders, friends. Some humans stayed permanently, drawn by bonds forged under radiation storms and collapsing skies. Others carried the memory onward, a weight and a promise entwined. Far from the resettled worlds, in the dark between stars, systems continued to age and die. Supernovae still bloomed without warning. Asteroids still drifted on collision courses. The universe did not change its nature, but it had learned something new about one of its inhabitants. When the next extinction loomed, alerts rippled outward as they always had. Councils convened. Calculations were made. And somewhere, far sooner than logic recommended, engines ignited. Drives burned hot and loud. Fleets assembled not in perfect formation, but in furious haste. Evacuation, it seemed, no longer required permission.